The Americans appear, but never twice in the same place. Never twice on the same line. Never twice in a pattern he can read. He had been promised at the sniper course in Germany that the Americans were green troops, soft, slow, and predictable. He is finding something else. This is the puzzle that haunted German snipers across the Western Front from D-Day to the Rhine. They had been trained in what most historians regard as the most rigorous sniping curriculum in the world. They had earned their craft against the Red Army at Stalingrad and Kursk. They were by 1944 among the most lethal small-arms specialists Europe had ever produced. And the Americans, these supposedly inexperienced replacements stumbling out of landing craft into the Norman bocage, were doing something to them that neither training nor experience could explain. The verdict on what they encountered, repeated again and again in post-war German accounts, came down to a single word: baffled. Not afraid, not outgunned, but baffled. It was the cognitive failure of an experienced professional confronted by a problem his profession had never encountered. To understand what was happening, we have to go back 5 months before D-Day to a manual printed by the United States War Department in February 1944. It was a manual that contained one of the strangest, most counterintuitive instructions ever issued to a large infantry army, an instruction that German sniper doctrine had no answer for, because no army the Germans had previously faced had ever required it of every single rifleman on the line. July 1944, the hedgerows of Normandy. A German sniper of the 12th SS Panzer Division, with 2 years on the Eastern Front and more than 100 confirmed kills behind him, settles into his position. He has chosen it with the patience that defined his craft. A hedgerow with good concealment, a clear field of fire across a sunken lane, and a withdrawal route through the orchard at his back. He has done this hundreds of times in Belarus, in Ukraine, and in the Carpathians. The pattern was always the same. The enemy moved along the same trails. Day after day, water carriers used the same path to the well. Messengers ran between the same 2 trees. Sentries paced the same 50 meters. The sniper waited, watched, and built his mental map of who walked where and when. The Americans were not, as the German sniper in his hedgerow assumed, simply lucky. They had been told in writing by their own army to do exactly what they were doing. And what they were doing was breaking the German sniper system, one missed shot at a time. This is the story of how one line of doctrine, written in dry technical English and drilled into millions of American soldiers, quietly took apart the most feared sniper army in the world. To understand why varying routes baffled German snipers specifically, you need to understand what German sniper doctrine actually was. And to understand that, you need to understand where it came from. The Wehrmacht did not begin the war with a serious sniper program. In the early months of Operation Barbarossa in 1941, German rifle companies had no designated marksmen of significance. The Treaty of Versailles had long restricted German precision rifle development. The first wave of soldiers who poured east in June 1941 were trained in mass fire tactics, not stealth and patience. The Red Army taught them the lesson. Soviet snipers operating from concealed positions in the swamps and forests of Belarus, in the rubble of Stalingrad, and in the wheat fields of the Ukrainian steppe, began inflicting catastrophic losses on German officers, machine gun crews, artillery observers, and runners. By the end of 1941, German divisional commanders were filing urgent reports demanding sniper countermeasures. The response was methodical. The Wehrmacht stood up its first centralized sniper school in 1942, with additional facilities following in 1943 and 1944. The Waffen-SS opened its own program. By 1944, a graduate of the German sniper course had spent weeks in some of the most demanding individual combat instruction any army on earth was running. But the curriculum was built around a single insight that mattered more than anything else. Snipers do not hunt soldiers. Snipers hunt routines. Sepp Allerberger, an Austrian conscript who became the second most successful sniper of the entire Wehrmacht with 257 confirmed kills, was sent to the sniper course in 1943. The instruction he received is documented in the memoir compiled from his wartime notebooks. The method was simple in its statement and pitiless in its application. You did not begin a sniper engagement by shooting. You began by watching. You spent hours, sometimes days, mapping the behavior of the enemy on the other side of the line. Who walked where, when food was carried forward, where the latrines were dug, which paths the messengers used, which sentries paced which sections of trench, and at what intervals. The Eastern Front was a perfect laboratory for this method. The Red Army by 1943 operated largely from prepared trench systems excavated over months. Communication trenches connected forward positions to the rear. Wells, kitchens, and ammunition points sat at fixed locations. Men used the same path every day because the paths had been dug for them, and because going off the path meant going through mud, wire, or mines. Once a German sniper had identified the pattern, the killing followed almost automatically. He did not need to find a target. He needed only to be in position when a target arrived at a place where targets always arrived. Matthias Hetzenauer, the highest-scoring Wehrmacht sniper of the war with 345 confirmed kills, operated this way across the southern sector of the Eastern Front. So did Allerberger. So did the unnamed thousands of German snipers who fanned out across Belarus and Ukraine in 1943 and 1944. They were not, as Hollywood would later portray them, masters of duels. They were masters of patience. The skill was not the trigger pull. The skill was the reading of human habit. This is the critical point. The German sniper system as it stood in the summer of 1944 was not a system for shooting men. It was a system for waiting for men. Every doctrinal element and every training emphasis had been refined around the assumption that an enemy of sufficient size and discipline would develop predictable behaviors that a patient observer could exploit. In the spring of 1944, the Germans began shifting some of their most experienced sniper personnel west. The men sent west carried with them an enormous self-confidence built on Eastern Front numbers. They had killed Soviets by the hundreds. They had been awarded the Iron Cross, the German Cross in gold, and in some cases the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross, Germany's highest combat decoration. They believed with reason that they were good at their job. What they did not yet know, what no one in the German high command had yet had reason to discover, was that their method had a single hidden assumption. The assumption was that the enemy would behave, that the enemy would, over the course of days or weeks, develop patterns the observer could read, and that somewhere in the geometry of the front line, a path would be walked twice, then 5 times, then 20. It had never occurred to them that an army could be trained as a matter of written doctrine never to walk the same path twice. And there is the first thread of why the title contains the word baffled. The Germans were not facing a culture of recklessness. They were not facing country boys who hated trails. They were facing something far stranger from a doctrinal standpoint. They were facing an army that had been instructed in writing to do the one thing their entire profession had never anticipated. That instruction had a specific source, a specific date, and a specific publication number printed at the top of every copy. We will get to it in a moment, but first we have to look at the place where the collision began. Because before the doctrine even reached its first major test, the German sniper system enjoyed a brief, devastating, and ultimately misleading period of dominance. That period was Normandy, and what happened there nearly convinced the Germans that they had won the sniping war on the Western Front. It is what makes the reversal that came afterwards so puzzling to them, and what makes the question in the title sharper than it first appears. In the first weeks after D-Day, German snipers in Normandy were extraordinarily effective. American casualty reports from June and early July 1944 record sniper hits in numbers that surprised even battle-hardened officers. The reason was the terrain. The Norman bocage, fields bordered by earthen banks, 10 or 12 feet high, topped with centuries of hedge growth, turned every field into a small fortress. German defenders camouflaged themselves on the inside corners of these earthen walls, with machine guns sighted on opposite corners of each field and snipers in the foliage above. American troops ordered forward through this country were funneled into killing zones every few hundred yards. The official military museum record of one such moment, taken from the account of Sergeant Worm of the 26th Infantry Regiment, 1st Infantry Division, describes a pre-dawn patrol of 3 men on June 18, 1944. We went down a lane, and I slowly opened the gate. It was quiet and the field looked empty. We walked in, I guess, about 30 yards or so, and out of my peripheral vision, I saw a German soldier aiming a rifle at me. He got me through the neck and the bullet came out of my back. Worm survived. His patrol did not, and his story stood in for hundreds of similar accounts. Through June and into July, German snipers in the hedgerows ran up kill counts that drew comparisons to the Eastern Front. Up to 75% of American casualties in Normandy were caused by mortar fire and indirect weapons. But among the rest, the proportion attributed to snipers was significant enough that Allied newspapers began calling German marksmen a psychological weapon. This was the moment when the Germans believed they were winning the sniping war. And from the perspective of Sepp Allerberger's training school, they had every reason to. American troops in those first weeks were moving in patterns. Officers were standing where they could be seen. Messengers were running the same fields twice. The bocage looked to the German observer like a Belarusian salient with worse cover. But two things were happening behind the scenes that the Germans could not yet see. The first was that the green American replacements were being killed off and replaced by survivors. By mid-July, the rifle companies in Normandy contained a new kind of American soldier. A man who had personally watched his sergeant be shot, his lieutenant be shot, and his best friend be shot, often within the same week. Survival had imposed an education that no training depot could match. The second, and more important, was that those survivors had something to fall back on. They had been issued the answer before they left the United States. They had been drilled in it during stateside training. They had read it in the small pamphlets carried in their pack. Most of them had not understood what it meant when they first encountered it, because the danger that gave it meaning had not yet appeared. The document was titled Field Manual 2175, Scouting, Patrolling, and Sniping, published by the United States War Department on February 6, 1944. It was distributed across the entire United States Army during the spring before the invasion of France. Inside it, on the pages dealing with the conduct of reconnaissance patrols, was a single instruction printed in plain technical English. The exact text, as preserved in the original 1944 mimeograph and in every subsequent reprint, stated, "Return route." The scout should not return by the same route. His best guide to his return is his memory of the landmarks passed on the way out. That is the entire instruction. 24 words, no emphasis, no explanation of why, no theory of sniper psychology behind it, just a flat directive in the same tone the manual used to describe the cleaning of a rifle or the construction of an outguard. The scout should not return by the same route. 24 words. And those 24 words were the answer to everything the German sniper school had built its method on. The instruction was the formal expression of a doctrine the United States Army Infantry School at Fort Benning had been developing throughout the late 1930s and early 1940s. The school's approach to small unit movement had been shaped by lessons from the First World War, where American officers had observed German artillery and machine gun crews tracking the paths of supply parties and exterminating them piecemeal. The conclusion the infantry school drew from that experience was simple. Routes are weapons in the enemy's hands. Routes once used should be considered burned ground. By 1944, the doctrine had filtered into every level of American infantry training. It appeared not only in FM 2175, but in the small pocket pamphlets issued to platoon leaders, in the lectures given at officer candidate school, and in the unwritten standing orders of veteran sergeants. By the time a soldier landed at Omaha Beach in June 1944, he had been told in some form that the path he had just walked was now the property of the enemy. He was not to use it again. The men of Allerberger's generation had no comparable training. The German manual on patrolling treated route selection as a tactical detail, not a doctrinal absolute. Soviet manuals treated it the same way. A German or Soviet patrol leader who decided, for sound reasons of speed or simplicity, to use a familiar route was acting within his profession's accepted practice. An American patrol leader who did the same after February 1944 was violating doctrine. The result by August of 1944 was that the German sniper standing patient in his hedgerow position was waiting for behavior that the American Army had specifically forbidden. He was waiting for the third man to walk the line the first two men had walked, and the third man had been trained before he ever crossed the English Channel not to do that. That is the mechanism. That is the answer to the question in the title. The Germans were baffled because their entire system was built on the assumption that disciplined troops would, despite themselves, fall into routines. The Americans had been disciplined in writing to do the opposite of what discipline normally produces, the opposite of routine. The men who learned this lesson in Normandy, the Wehrmacht survivors, and the replacements who became sergeants did not write memoirs about the doctrine. They were rarely articulate about it later. What they did do in growing numbers through July and August of 1944 was follow the manual. Private Joseph Dobrowolski did not fight for glory. Neither did the thousands of riflemen whose names appear once in unit histories and never again. They fought because the men around them were fighting, and they survived in part because a manual told them to walk a different road home. Every like on this video is a small thing, but it keeps the memory of the doctrine and the men who lived because of it in front of people who care about getting the history right. By the early autumn of 1944, the war in northwestern Europe had shifted from the Bocage to the Siegfried Line, the German fortified belt along the western border of the Reich. The American First Army had broken out of Normandy. The German army had retreated, regrouped, and dug in. What happened next is what makes the answer to the title sharper, not vaguer. The terrain along the German frontier in October and November of 1944 included the Hurtgen Forest, roughly 50 square miles of dense conifer woodland, broken by deep gorges and steep ridges cut by a handful of unpaved trails. By any rational tactical analysis, it was the worst possible place to conduct an offensive. American historians, including Charles B. McDonald, who served as a company commander in the battle and later wrote the official Army history, would later describe it as a misconceived and basically fruitless battle that should have been avoided. But the offensive went forward. From September 19, 1944 through December 16, the American First Army fed division after division into the forest. The losses were staggering. By the time the operation was halted, American casualties ranged from 33,000 to 55,000 men. 3 of the 4 divisions sent into the forest in the autumn would later need to be largely rebuilt from replacements. And inside that forest, the German sniper operated under conditions that should have been ideal. Visibility was short. Routes were limited to established trails. The Americans had to pass through the same choke points repeatedly. The opportunity to identify patterns in the classic Eastern Front method was exactly what the German sniper schools had trained for. Yet the German sniper return on the Hurtgen, while still serious, fell short of what the conditions seemed to promise. Post-war German accounts express a kind of professional frustration with what happened there. They had the terrain, they had the positions, they had, in many cases, the trained men. What they did not have, what they had stopped having by the fall of 1944, was an enemy whose path could be predicted. The reason was that the doctrine of FM 21-75 had now had 3 months to settle into the American formations doing the fighting. The 1st Infantry Division had been on the line since June. The 4th, 9th, and 28th had each absorbed enough combat experience that the doctrine of varied routes had become reflex. The 22nd Infantry Regiment, part of the 4th Infantry Division, was commanded in November 1944 by Colonel Charles T. Lanham, a 42-year-old West Point graduate who had also served as an instructor at the infantry school at Fort Benning. Lanham was, in his earlier career, one of the men who had helped draft the manuals the Army now used. He had personally taught the doctrine of route variation. His regiment entered the Hurtgen on November 16th. By the time it was relieved, it had suffered nearly 2,800 casualties, more than 3/4 of its strength. But of the survivors, almost none had been killed by sniper fire. The casualties came from artillery, from mortar barrages, from machine guns sighted at intersection points, from booby traps, from mines, and from the cold. The sniper, who in the Eastern Front model would have been a primary inflictor of officer casualties, was largely absent from the casualty profile. Not because he was not there, he was there, but because the men he was waiting for were not walking the paths he was watching. This is where the German confusion becomes documented. Field interrogation reports from American intelligence officers in late 1944 and early 1945 record German prisoners commenting repeatedly on the unpredictability of American small unit movement. The pattern was consistent. The Germans expected disciplined troops to behave in patterns. The Americans behaved in patterns of a sort. They patrolled, they relieved, they resupplied. But the geographic expression of the patterns kept moving. A trail used once was rarely used twice. A gap in a hedge was used and then avoided. A path to a forward observation post was traced through a different set of trees each night. The German term for this kind of cognitive failure, used in post-war interrogations and in the diaries of officers who had served on both fronts, was unbegreiflich, incomprehensible. They did not mean the word loosely, they meant it in the literal sense. The system they had been trained to read had broken down because the enemy was producing behavior their reading apparatus had no slot for. You can see the mechanism now more clearly than the German sniper in his hedgerow could see it. He had been trained to identify patterns and to wait. The pattern was the third man following the path of the first two. The doctrine of FM 2175 said, "There will be no third man. There will be a man, but he will walk a different line." The sniper's hours of patient observation would yield nothing because the data he was collecting was being deliberately scrambled by an instruction printed in a manual on the other side of the Atlantic. And here we come to the deeper point. The Americans were not, as later mythology sometimes claimed, just naturally unpredictable. They were not chaos in human form. They were highly disciplined troops following a written rule that happened by its design to produce behavior the German sniper school had no answer for. Discipline, in the German sense, meant repeating the correct action. Discipline, in the American sense, meant repeating the correct rule. And the rule said, do not repeat the action. That distinction, small as it sounds, was decisive. It is the answer to the question of why the Germans were not merely outmaneuvered or outgunned. They were baffled. They were a profession looking at output their profession had no theory for. They were not unmanned by it. Many German snipers continued to fight skillfully through to the end of the war, but they were robbed of the multiplier their method had previously provided. The sniper who on the Eastern Front would have collected 20 kills from a single well-chosen position would on the Western Front in late 1944 collect 2 and then watch the position run dry of traffic. The German answer to this development, when one was attempted, did not work. We will get to that in a moment. Because the Americans, having figured out that they had a doctrinal weapon their enemy could not match, were beginning to combine it with something else, something that turned the German sniper from a hunter into a hunted man on the same ground he had once dominated. There is a temptation when writing this kind of story to make the doctrine of varied routes the whole answer. It was not the whole answer. It was the foundation of a system that, by late 1944, had a second story built on top of it. The second story was American counter-sniper doctrine, and the second story is what turned the German sniper's bafflement from a problem he could endure into a problem that began killing him. Throughout the fall of 1944 and into the winter, American rifle units began employing a technique the German sniper school had not adequately anticipated. The technique was simple in concept and devastating in execution. Deliberately bait the German sniper with a moving target, then map his firing position from the bullet's path, then call indirect fire on the position before he could relocate. The technique only worked because of varied routes. The bait, a soldier or two moving deliberately across a field of fire, was credible to the German observer specifically because American troops genuinely did not move in patterns. The sniper looking out from his hedgerow had no reason to suspect a deception. The moving target looked like every other American he had seen in the past 3 months. A man going somewhere by a route no one had used yet. When he fired, he revealed his position. And the revelation was caught by an American team that had been waiting for it. The team would consist in most cases of 2 riflemen, a forward observer with a radio, and sometimes a designated marksman of their own. The radio went back to the supporting artillery battery. The artillery battery, by late 1944, was capable of dropping shells on a coordinate inside 3 minutes of a fire mission call. The German sniper, having taken a single shot at the bait, now had less than 3 minutes to evacuate a position he had often spent hours preparing. Sometimes he made it. Often he did not. This combination, the American doctrine of varied routes plus the American doctrine of artillery-coupled counter-sniper teams, produced a casualty exchange ratio on the Western Front that post-war German analysts found genuinely shocking. The sniper, who in 1942 in the East had been a force multiplier capable of immobilizing entire Soviet companies, was reduced in 1944 in the West to a high-skill specialist whose life expectancy in active operations was measured in weeks. There is a moment in Sepp Allerberger's wartime account where the contrast becomes explicit. By the early months of 1945, his unit, the 3rd Mountain Division, had been rotated from the Eastern Front to Austria, where it would eventually surrender to advancing American forces. Allerberger was captured by GIs in late April or early May of 1945. He survived the war. He was, in fact, one of a small number of Eastern Front sniping aces to do so. Most of his peers had been killed by the Soviets. What Allerberger experienced in his final weeks of combat against American troops was, by all accounts, a different kind of warfare from what he had practiced in the East. The patient method that had brought him 257 confirmed kills against the Red Army yielded much less against the Americans. The men he could see were not following the trails he expected. The men he shot at often did not appear in his scope a second time, and the artillery, when it came, was faster and more accurate than anything he had previously experienced. The German army did try to adapt. By the end of 1944, sniper schools were emphasizing more aggressive tactics, shorter waiting periods, faster relocation, and multiple positions per day. But the adaptation required something the German army no longer had: time, fuel, ammunition, and trained personnel in numbers sufficient to retrain its sniper corps. The men who had been schooled in Eastern Front methods were still in the field, still doing what they had been taught. They were now doing it against an enemy whose doctrine had taken out the foundation of the method. And here, a kind of grim irony enters the story. The Germans had built their sniper system in response to the Soviet snipers, who had butchered their officers in 1941 and 1942. They had built it well. They had built it carefully. They had built it around the assumption that disciplined troops would always eventually develop the kind of patterns that the Soviets had developed under the pressure of mass conscription and prepared trench warfare. The Americans broke that assumption, not by being more disciplined than the Soviets, and not by being braver, but by being trained to a different definition of discipline, a definition that said, the rules govern your behavior, but the rules are written so that your behavior never settles into geometry. If your father, your grandfather, or your uncle served in an American infantry regiment in Europe between 1944 and 1945, the doctrine in this video was part of his training. He may never have spoken of it. He may not have known the manual number, but he walked a different way home from every patrol, and that habit kept him alive. I would be honored to read his story in the comments. What unit did he serve in? Where did he fight? Those details matter more than any official archive. Now we come to the final piece, because while the doctrine of varied routes broke the German snipers' expectations, there is one more turn to the story, a turn that, when you see it clearly, makes the German bafflement not just professional, but philosophical. There is a temptation, looking back at this story from 80 years' distance, to make it a story about American superiority. That would be the wrong reading. The doctrine of varied routes did not make American soldiers better than German soldiers. It made American soldiers harder to kill in a specific way, and it did so because of a decision made years earlier by a small number of officers at the United States Army Infantry School at Fort Benning. Men who had absorbed the lessons of the First World War and concluded that the next war's foot soldier would need to think differently about the ground he walked on. The decision was unglamorous. A paragraph in a manual. The manual was one of dozens. The paragraph was eclipsed in its own time by far more prominent doctrinal innovations: combined arms theory, the fire direction center, the variable time fuse, and close air support. The doctrine of varied routes was a small thing, but it had a property few of the more glamorous innovations possessed. It worked at the level of the individual rifleman. It worked in the head of every soldier on the line. It did not require radios, trained gunners, or rear area infrastructure. It required one decision made every time a patrol ended: do not return by the route you took out. That decision, repeated by millions of soldiers across the European theater, was what broke the German sniper system in the West. Not the breakthrough at St. Lo, and not the encirclement at Falaise. It was a line of text in a 1944 manual, drilled into the muscle memory of teenagers from Brooklyn, Topeka, and Mobile, doing on the ground what the manual had told them to do. The German sniper sitting in his hedgerow or his pine wood was not a coward. He was not a fool. He was a professional whose profession had been quietly outmaneuvered by an idea his training had not prepared him to recognize. When German memoir writers tried, after the war, to put what they had experienced into words, the word that surfaced most often was the cognitive failure word. Not "we were outshot" and not "we were beaten," but variations on we could not understand. The behavior produced no readable pattern. The hours of observation yielded no useful data. The third man, the fourth man, the fifth, they never followed the line the first two had walked. And the sniper school had not taught a method for that. There is a deeper truth beneath the tactical reading. The German army went into the Second World War with one of the highest standards of small unit discipline in the world. German soldiers obeyed orders. They executed them precisely. They were, on average, better drilled than their American counterparts. American war correspondents in the early months of 1944, including Ernie Pyle, who lived with the infantry from Sicily to the Bulge, sometimes commented on how casual American troops seemed in comparison. But the German discipline was a discipline of behavior. Do this, now do that. The American discipline, in places where it mattered most, was a discipline of principle. Behave in such a way that no one can predict your behavior. Walk a different way back. Never the same trail twice. The difference, almost invisible on a parade ground, was enormous in combat. The German soldier who walked precisely the route he was told to walk was easy to kill. The American soldier who walked precisely the principle he was told to walk was hard to kill. The first kind of discipline produced order. The second kind produced order at one level and unpredictability at another. This is the verdict. The reason German snipers were baffled by American soldiers who never used the same path twice was not that the Americans were chaotic, natural, or born unpredictable. It was that the Americans had been disciplined to a kind of order the Germans did not recognize as order. Their movement looked random. It was not. It was the precise execution of a written rule. The rule simply happened to produce by design the one thing the German sniper system could not exploit: variation without pattern on a scale and across a duration the German observer had never previously encountered. What was won by FM 2175, paragraph 39, subparagraph B? It is hard to count because the men who lived because of it cannot be added up. The American casualty rate from sniper fire on the Western Front from August 1944 onward declined substantially from the catastrophic levels of June and July 1944 in Normandy. Some portion of that decline came from better counter-sniper teams. Some came from better artillery, but a significant share came from the simple, repeatable fact that the average American rifleman was not at the place the German sniper expected him to be. How many men is that? The Hurtgen Forest alone cost the Americans between 33,000 and 55,000 casualties over 88 days of combat. Most came from artillery, mortar fire, machine guns, mines, and the weather. The proportion from sniper fire in a forest where snipers should have been at their most lethal was small. Take 10% of those who lived. Take 1%. It is still thousands of men who came home in part because of 24 words in a 1944 manual. The men who walked a different path home from every patrol in Europe between 1944 and 1945 did not, for the most part, know they were enacting a piece of doctrinal genius. They simply walked a different way home because their sergeants had told them to, because their lieutenants had told them to, and because the manual the Army had handed them said to. And by doing it, they robbed the most experienced sniper army in the world of the multiplier that had made it deadly in the East. This is the closing point, and it is the closure of the title. The Germans were not baffled because the Americans were lucky. They were not baffled because the Americans were chaotic. They were baffled because the Americans were following a different definition of order than the one the German sniper school had been built to read. The cause in the title is never using the same path twice, but the deeper cause is the kind of army that can write that instruction down, distribute it to millions of men, and have them follow it without understanding why. The kind of army that trusts a paragraph in a manual to govern the behavior of a frightened 19-year-old in a field he has never seen before. That trust between the infantry school in Georgia and the riflemen in the Hurtgen was the real weapon. The varied route was its expression. The bafflement of the German sniper was its proof. If this forensic walkthrough gave you something to think about, hit the like button. It helps this channel reach viewers who care about getting the history right, not just the version that made it into the textbooks. Subscribe if you want the next chapter, because the men who built this system, the infantry school officers, the forward observers, the sergeants who drilled the doctrine into terrified replacements, and the riflemen who lived because they walked the other way home, they deserve to be understood, not just remembered. War is not always mathematics. Sometimes it is grammar. Sometimes it is 24 words in a manual. They had names and they walked home. If this exploration of the hidden tactics that shaped the battlefields of Europe has changed how you view the history of the infantry, please subscribe and like the channel. We are excavating the history that was nearly buried by time. Help us plant the seeds of the future. The next treasury of historical truth will soon be revealed.